The first light on the 15th of June, 1944, was no gentle sunrise. From the jagged coral bluffs of Saipan's western shore, Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi of Japan's 31st Army watched the horizon ignite in a smear of orange and gray. He smelled not salt, but the tang of cordite drifting from an armada that seemed to have no end. The low rumble that reached his ears carried the weight of a continent. Even before the first shell landed, Takahashi felt the ground tremble beneath the concussion of distant naval guns. He tightened his grip on the worn binoculars. Through the smoky dawn, the silhouettes multiplied: hulking battleships, lean cruisers, stubby landing craft. It was as if the sea itself had been forged into steel. Reports had warned of American strength, but nothing in Tokyo's communiques could match the sight of more than 500 Allied vessels stretched across the horizon. He could pick out the tallest masts of 7 fleet carriers and the squat, brutal lines of 11 battleships. Their 16-inch rifles could hurl a 2,700-pound shell more than 20 miles. When the first salvo came, the earth leapt beneath his boots. Coral fragments rattled like hail against his helmet. The concussion rattled his teeth, each blast a dull hammer striking the island's heart. He shouted orders, but the roar drowned his voice. Somewhere inland, ammunition stores already short from months of blockade would be crumbling to dust. Takahashi knew that his own battery could barely answer with the few shells left. Far beyond the smoke and spray, American Seabees waited aboard transports. Civilians turned sailors turned engineers, ready to drive 20-ton bulldozers onto the beach. Takahashi could not know the term pierced steel planking, nor the speed with which these men would lay a 7,000-foot runway for B-29 bombers. Yet the thunder of naval ordnance announced that a new kind of war had arrived, one where factories in faraway Ohio and California determined the fate of islands he had sworn to defend. A geyser of water leapt where a shell struck the reef, raining a warm mist across his face. He wiped it away and caught a faint metallic taste, oil and salt, and something acrid that was not the sea. Above the thunder of guns he imagined, or perhaps heard, the deep diesel growl of engines preparing to land. The false dawn deepened to a bruised gray as smoke thickened. Takahashi lowered his glasses. He had expected the sun, but what rose before him was fire. Corporal Thomas Red McAllister leaned over the rail of his landing ship, tank as the invasion fleet crept toward Saipan's beaches. The humid Pacific air clung like a wet blanket and smelled of diesel, brine, and the faint sweetness of pineapple drifting from unseen groves ashore. Beneath his boots, the deck vibrated with the slow pulse of engines. He wiped sweat from his brow with a calloused hand, thinking briefly of the cornfields outside Dayton where, a year ago, he had been running a bulldozer for a county road crew. Now the same skill would help crack open the empire of Japan. Around him, the 20-ton Caterpillar bulldozers were chained and ready, their blades polished like mirrors, despite the sea air. Red had spent weeks rehearsing the plan. Once Marines secured a narrow strip of coral beach, Seabees would surge ashore and begin carving an airfield out of the raw island. The brass promised a 7,000-foot bomber runway in less than 10 days, an audacious timetable even by American standards. But Red had seen the figures. In stateside yards, Liberty ships were sliding into the water at the rate of 3 every 2 days. If the nation could build an ocean's worth of shipping almost overnight, why not a runway in the middle of the Pacific? The sky to the east flickered as the great guns of the battleships opened again, sending 2,700-pound shells arcing toward the beach. Each concussion made the LST shiver like a struck drum. Marines crouched in the well deck, checking weapons with the calm of men who had drilled for months. Red caught the sharp scent of gunpowder on the wind and tightened the strap of his steel helmet. A boatswain's whistle shrilled, engines surged. The heavy bow doors creaked open to reveal a wall of smoke and coral spray. The landing craft in front churned toward the beach, their ramps already spattered with salt foam. Red guided his bulldozer forward, the big diesel coughing to life with a chest-deep growl. He felt the vibration travel through the machine's frame and into his bones, a familiar rhythm, now turned to war. As the LST's ramp clanged onto the reef, sunlight caught the bulldozer's blade. Red eased the throttle, and the machine rolled into the surf, water hissing against hot steel. Behind him, the sky rumbled like an endless thunderstorm. Ahead lay a barren plateau that by week's end would cradle B-29 superfortresses, each capable of carrying 10,000 pounds of bombs over 3,000 miles. Red grinned beneath his grime. He wasn't merely landing on an island. He was driving the first length of America's long runway to victory. The faint rattle of the telegraph never stopped in the Naval General Staff Building, a tired rhythm beneath the smoke-stained ceilings of wartime Tokyo. Admiral Toyota Soemu sat at the end of a long oak table littered with dispatches, the glow of a single lamp painting hard lines across his face. Outside, the city smelled of damp ash and coal smoke, a reminder that even the heart of the empire was beginning to feel the strain of war. It was early June 1944, and every report carried darker tidings. One cable from Truk warned of American task forces massing beyond the Marianas. Another, decoded just hours before, whispered of a new long-range bomber, B-29 Superfortress, capable of carrying a 10,000-pound bomb load more than 3,000 miles. Toyota read the specifications twice, his breath catching on the words. If the Americans could strike the Japanese homeland from islands like Saipan, the Emperor's heartland would no longer be beyond reach. Fuel reports were worse. Aviation gasoline stocks, once counted in comfortable reserves, had fallen below 30,000 kiloliters, a fraction of what the Navy required even for routine operations. The tankers that once fed Japan's fleet now lay rusting on the sea floor, victims of an enemy submarine campaign that grew bolder each month. Toyota had ordered rationing weeks earlier, but the figures were still sinking like lead. By autumn, some staff officers whispered there might not be enough fuel to move the fleet at all. He rose and crossed to the window. Beyond the paper screens, Tokyo lay under a low ceiling of gray clouds. Somewhere far to the south, an American armada was gathering with the patience of a tidal wave. Toyota had served in the Navy for decades, long enough to know the smell of impending defeat. He could almost hear the distant thunder of naval guns across the Pacific, a sound his imagination filled in from memory of past bombardments. The staff officers around him spoke in clipped tones about reinforcing the Marianas, but the numbers on their charts told another story. Japan had no ships to spare, no fuel to move them, and no time to build what was needed. Even the mighty Yamato, pride of the fleet, could not sail without oil. Toyota turned back to the table and tapped the B-29 report with a forefinger. "If this is true," he said quietly, "our perimeter is already broken." The room fell silent. Outside, the telegraph clattered on, indifferent to human despair. He closed his eyes for a moment and listened. The soft metallic clicking seemed to merge with the imagined rumble of guns far away, a sound that told him the enemy had already reached Tokyo in spirit, if not in fact. From the jagged cliffs of Saipan, Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi pressed his back against the warm coral and dared a glance at the sea. Dawn's smoke had thinned just enough for him to see the full breadth of the American armada. It was as if the ocean itself had turned to iron. Ships dotted the horizon until they blurred into the pale sky, an unbroken line of steel that seemed to have no end. He counted as best he could: carriers, battleships, cruisers, the small dark shapes of landing craft darting like beetles between the giants. Intelligence had warned of 500 ships. Seeing them with his own eyes, Takahashi believed there might be more. He recognized the tall, square profiles of fleet carriers, at least 7 by his rough reckoning, and the muscular silhouettes of battleships whose 16-inch rifles could hurl 2,700-pound shells across 20 miles of sea. Each time those guns spoke, the island shook as though the earth itself rebelled. Coral dust stung his eyes. The concussion hammered through his chest, a rhythm without pause. He tried to direct his battery's fire, but their shells were few, and their field guns already choked with heat. Weeks of blockade had left the 31st Army with ammunition stocks measured in hours. Offshore, American supply ships moved with unhurried precision. He could see Liberty ships, standard freighters produced at a rate of 3 every 2 days in shipyards half a world away, sliding among the warships like patient pack animals. Around them hovered scores of LSTS and smaller landing craft, a machine of invasion that fed itself even as it attacked. Takahashi thought of the long nights when his men had rationed rice to less than 2,000 calories a day, and of the brief telegram from Tokyo promising reinforcements that never came. Now, watching the endless movement of American vessels, he felt the first cold certainty that no reinforcements could ever match this. Another salvo thundered from the battleships, and the sky above the reef filled with smoke and screaming metal. Somewhere behind that curtain, engineers were already preparing to land. Men who would bring bulldozers and steel planking, who would turn this coral island into an airfield for bombers capable of reaching Japan itself. A gust of wind carried the sharp scent of burning oil and the salt of the sea. Takahashi lowered his binoculars. The enemy fleet stretched to the limits of vision, an industrial constellation brighter than any dawn. He understood then that this was no single battle, but the visible proof of a nation whose power could not be measured in ships alone. Night on Saipan came thick and heavy, carrying the smell of burned powder and wet coral. Corporal Thomas Red McAllister wiped his sleeve across a face slick with sweat and salt as he coaxed his 20-ton Caterpillar bulldozer down the newly secured beach. Behind him, the sea still glowed with the occasional flash of naval gunfire. Ahead lay a moonscape of shell holes and shattered palm trunks. The Marines had fought their way inland only hours earlier. Now it was the Seabees' turn to wage a different kind of war. Diesel engines rumbled like an approaching storm as the first wave of construction crews followed him ashore. Their mission was precise and audacious: transform this scarred coral plateau into a bomber runway in less than 10 days. Red's hands knew the levers by instinct, muscles remembering the Ohio road crew he had left behind. But here the stakes were measured in continents. From this very field, B-29 superfortresses, each capable of carrying 10,000 pounds of bombs over 3,000 miles, would soon lift off to strike the Japanese homeland. The work began in the dark, lit only by headlamps and the ghostly glow of acetylene torches. Bulldozers pushed aside debris, while graders leveled the pitted ground. Crates of pierced steel planking clanged open, each sheet of perforated metal a single piece in a vast metallic quilt. The Seabees had rehearsed this dance on Pacific beaches from Guadalcanal to Tarawa. Every man knew his part. Red felt the familiar vibration of the big diesel beneath him and smiled grimly. This was construction turned to strategy. Far offshore Liberty ships stood silhouetted against the night, patient as floating warehouses. In American yards, those ships were being launched at a rate of 3 every 2 days, an industrial rhythm that defied belief. They carried the steel and aviation fuel that made this midnight miracle possible. For the Japanese soldiers watching from hidden caves, the sight of a runway rising almost overnight must have seemed supernatural, proof that American abundance was itself a weapon. By dawn, the first section of the runway gleamed under a haze of salt spray. Red climbed from his machine, muscles trembling from hours of labor, and watched a pair of Marines pace the new strip, their boots ringing on steel. In a few days, the deep-throated engines of B-29s would echo across this same field, carrying their 10,000-pound payloads toward the factories and cities of Japan. Red drew a long breath, the air thick with diesel smoke and the faint sweetness of crushed coral. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what he and his fellow Seabees had built. Not just a runway, but the next mile of the long road to victory. Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi sat stiffly on a wooden crate inside the makeshift American prisoner compound, the rough planks warm from the afternoon sun. The battle for Saipan had ended for him in a blur of smoke and pain. A fragment from an American mortar shell had torn through his leg, and he had awakened to find himself carried not by comrades, but by Marines whose faces were unreadable beneath the grime of combat. Now the sounds of war had faded to distant echoes, replaced by the low murmur of American voices and the hiss of boiling coffee. A medic knelt beside him, washing the wound with practiced speed. The sting of antiseptic was sharp but clean, a scent so different from the acrid gunpowder and sulfur of the battlefield that Takahashi almost flinched. A corpsman offered a tin mug. He hesitated, then accepted. The liquid inside was hot and bitter. Coffee, he had heard of it but never tasted it. Its rich aroma mingled with the ocean breeze, a fragrance at once foreign and disarming. An interrogator approached, a young Nisei soldier whose Japanese carried the cadence of California. His questions were gentle, almost conversational. Unit strength, artillery positions, the state of supply. Takahashi answered cautiously, but his mind kept drifting to the small details around him. Stacks of ammunition boxes lay beside crates of food. GIS moved easily among them, their uniforms dusty but their faces well-fed. He noticed the wrappers of American chocolate, Hershey bars, passed casually from hand to hand. He thought of his own men rationing rice to less than 2,000 calories a day, of the desperate search for ammunition that had defined the last weeks. Here the Americans seemed to possess not just food and shells, but an endless reserve of energy. Their 105mm howitzers, capable of 10 rounds a minute, had pounded his positions without pause. He wondered how many shells they had fired. Certainly more than his entire regiment had been allotted for the campaign. A Marine offered him a square of chocolate. Takahashi accepted it almost absently. The sweetness flooded his mouth, a taste both luxurious and humbling. It was not cruelty that defeated him now, but something far more implacable: abundance. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the compound in molten gold, Takahashi felt the truth settle heavier than his wound. The empire he had sworn to defend had no answer for a nation that could fight a war with such generosity of supply. The lingering sweetness on his tongue was the flavor of inevitable defeat. The rain tapped softly on the tiled roof of the Tokyo interrogation room as Admiral Nagano Osami set down his pen. It was late autumn of 1945. But his thoughts drifted back to the dark winter of 1942–43, when the first real crack had opened in Japan's war plans. Guadalcanal, an island many in the Imperial Navy had scarcely heard of before the war, had been the place where the arithmetic of American power began to outweigh every bold strategy the empire could devise. He remembered the frantic nights when Japan's best sailors tried to reinforce the island under the cover of darkness. The Tokyo Express, as the Americans mockingly called the high-speed destroyer runs, dashed back and forth across the slot. Yet for every ton of supplies Nagano's forces managed to land, the Americans landed 10. U.S. shipyards back home were already launching Liberty ships at a rate of 3 every 2 days. By the time Japan delivered a single convoy, American docks had turned out another merchant fleet. He had read the reports then. U.S. merchant tonnage climbing toward 50 million deadweight tons by the end of 1944, a figure so vast it seemed almost mythic. Even in 1942, the trajectory was clear. Japan's own shipyards, starved of steel and hammered by the very submarines they sought to evade, could not replace losses quickly enough. For every destroyer the Imperial Navy put to sea, America produced a dozen freighters and the escorts to guard them. Guadalcanal had become a slow-motion revelation. Japan fought with courage and skill, but the Americans fought with factories. Every time a Japanese cruiser limped home, the enemy replaced his losses in the time it took to clean the salt from a deck gun. Nagano had argued for bold counterstrokes, but the numbers mocked him. In the interrogation room now, the young American officer across the table asked him when he first knew Japan could not win. Nagano's gaze wandered to the rain streaking the window. He thought of the endless streams of Liberty and Victory ships, of the Marines who never seemed to lack for ammunition, of the skies dark with new aircraft before old ones had even burned out. Guadalcanal, he said quietly, when we could not reinforce as fast as you could. That was the beginning of the end. Outside, the rain kept its patient rhythm, like the steady beat of American assembly lines that had drowned the empire in steel long before Hiroshima. 19 February 1945. Black sand and sulfurous steam rose from the beaches of Iwo Jima as the first waves of U.S. Marines surged ashore. The volcanic grit clung to boots and weapons like wet ash, turning every step into a struggle. Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi, still limping from his Saipan wound but now back in Japan, heard the news by radio and felt a cold recognition settle in his chest. The Americans were coming again, and this time the very earth seemed to conspire with them. From offshore, American battleships unleashed their 16-inch rifles. Each shell, weighing nearly 2,700 pounds, gouged craters in the black sand and sent columns of smoke spiraling into the pale winter sky. B-24 Liberators pounded the island ahead of the landing, and still the Japanese 109th Army under General Kuribayashi held its fire until the Marines were nearly on the beach. When the defenders finally answered, the air filled with a metallic scream as mortars and machine guns cut through the surf. The Marines kept coming. By nightfall, more than 30,000 had landed. Over the next weeks, the island became a furnace. American casualties would climb above 26,000, with nearly 7,000 dead, yet replacements and supplies never ceased. Ammunition and rations arrived in a torrent, ferried by Liberty ships and LSTS that seemed as inexhaustible as the tide. For the Japanese defenders, there would be no replacements. Of the roughly 20,000 who began the battle, barely 1,000 survived. Kuribayashi's men fought from tunnels and caves, their courage unquestioned. But courage could not match the arithmetic of American industry. Naval guns fired round after round without pause. Artillery batteries ashore maintained a tempo of destruction Japan could not hope to equal. Takahashi, listening from a military hospital, imagined the sulfur stench rising from the island's vents and the ceaseless thunder of American guns. He recalled the chocolate in the POW camp, the taste of abundance that had haunted him since Saipan. Now that same abundance was scouring Iwo Jima clean of defenders. When word finally came that only 1,000 of Kuribayashi's men had survived and that the stars and stripes now flew over Mount Suribachi, Takahashi understood the larger truth. The United States would pay any price in blood, and its factories would ensure that price was always affordable. April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, dawn broke gray and heavy over the Ryukyu Islands as the U.S. 10th Army moved toward Okinawa. A warm wind carried the scent of brine and the distant ozone tang of naval cordite. Far out to sea, an Allied armada larger than any yet assembled in the Pacific waited like a living wall. 7 fleet carriers, 6 light carriers, 18 battleships, and more than 300 escorts. The sheer tonnage of steel, over 300,000 tons of shipping, was itself a declaration. Civilians like Uema Chie huddled in limestone caves as the first shells shrieked across the island. The ground shook with each impact, dust falling in slow curtains. Uema clutched the hand of her younger brother and whispered a prayer as the sky turned the color of lead. Above the din, the drone of American aircraft grew into a constant presence. Fighter bombers roared low, their engines a metallic hymn of inevitability. When the invasion force finally came ashore, tens of thousands of Marines and soldiers poured onto the beaches in a tide of khaki and olive drab. The 32nd Japanese Army fought from entrenched ridges, and the battle soon became a siege. By May, the seasonal rains arrived, drenching both armies. Foxholes collapsed into mud, rifles rusted overnight. The smell of rot and cordite mingled in the warm downpour. American engineers laid steel matting over sucking mud to keep supply lines open, while Liberty ships and LSTS continued to deliver men, food, and ammunition despite the storms. Casualties mounted with relentless arithmetic. The Americans would suffer nearly 49,000 casualties, about 12,000 killed. The Japanese defenders lost between 90 and 110,000 soldiers, while an estimated 100,000 civilians perished in the crossfire. For those like Uema, the distinction between soldier and non-combatant dissolved in the monsoon's gray sheets of rain. Yet even in the chaos, the industrial machine behind the U.S. invasion never faltered. The fleet's carriers maintained round-the-clock air support. Battleships fired their 16-inch guns until their barrels glowed. Replacement parts arrived faster than Japanese gunners could destroy equipment. For the defenders, every broken gun and every empty magazine signaled the slow but certain death of an empire. On a hilltop overlooking Shuri Line, Uema watched the unending convoy of American ships beyond the reef, their running lights flickering through the mist like an iron constellation. She understood none of the war's larger strategies, but she sensed the meaning in her bones. This power was inexhaustible. No storm, no sacrifice, no act of valor could turn it back. When the guns finally fell silent in June, the monsoon continued, rain washing over the shattered island as if to cleanse it. The sea beyond remained crowded with ships, patient and unshaken, a living proof that the United States could not be defeated. November 1945. The chill of early winter settled over Tokyo, carrying the faint odor of smoke from neighborhoods still scarred by firebombing. Inside a quiet Allied interrogation room, Admiral Toyota Suemu faced his questioners. The former commander of the combined fleet sat upright in his faded uniform, the weight of defeat etched into the lines of his face. The American officer across the table asked when he had realized Japan could not win. Toyota's gaze lingered on the single sheet of paper before him, a typed summary of Japan's dwindling resources. Aviation gasoline stocks had fallen below 30,000 kiloliters in the summer of 1944, barely weeks of supply for the fleet. By mid-1945, aircraft production had dropped by half and the once proud Navy lacked the fuel even to sortie its surviving ships. He spoke deliberately, his voice low but steady. "Your resources are bountiful," he admitted, "and your production capacity tremendous. We could not match it." The interpreter's English carried the words into the room like a quiet verdict. Toyota described how American bombers had stripped Japan of industrial strength. From airfields the Seabees had carved at Saipan and Tinian, B-29 superfortresses with 10,000-pound bomb loads crossed 3,000 miles of ocean to incinerate the factories of Nagoya and Osaka. Liberty ships, built at a rhythm of 3 every 2 days, carried the oil, steel, and ammunition that kept the assault unbroken. The young American major listening across the table scribbled notes, aware that these admissions were more than mere confessions. They were testimony to a fact already evident to those who had fought on both sides. Democracy's assembly lines had become weapons as decisive as any battleship or bomb. Outside, the city hummed with the tentative sounds of post-war life, the clatter of bicycles, the distant rumble of trains. Toyota heard it all as he spoke of lost opportunities and the moment, long before the atomic bomb, when Japan's leaders understood the war was unwinnable. Guadalcanal, the Marianas, the ceaseless advance of an enemy who replaced losses faster than Japan could count them. Each had been a rung on the ladder of inevitability. When the session ended, Toyota remained seated for a moment, his breath visible in the cold air. Beyond the window, the sky was pale and empty, but he imagined he could still hear the far-off rumble of American industry, a sound that had carried across the Pacific and decided the fate of nations. In a tall windowed office of the War Department in Washington, the winter of 1945 settled like a gray shawl across the city. Rows of typewriters clattered in a steady rhythm, their sound a mechanical echo of the factories that had fueled the war. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Foster, an Army logistics officer who had spent the war tracking tonnage and production curves, spread a fresh set of charts across his desk. They told a story more decisive than any single battle. On one sheet, the line of American gross domestic product arced steeply upward, an increase of roughly 72% since 1940. Below it, a thinner line representing Japan's economy sagged to a fraction of the U.S. total, barely 13% by 1944 and still shrinking. Foster tapped the figures with his pencil, marveling at their scale. In less than 4 years, American shipyards had built 2,710 Liberty ships and 531 Victory ships, creating a merchant fleet of nearly 50 million deadweight tons. Some yards launched a fully loaded freighter every 2 days, a pace so fast that in a single month the United States produced more shipping than Japan could launch in a year. Aircraft numbers told the same story. Nearly 4,000 B-29 superfortresses, each capable of carrying 10,000 pounds of bombs across 3,000 miles, now stood ready or already flying missions from the Marianas. Over 50,000 M4 Sherman tanks had rolled from American assembly lines, standardized so precisely that a broken final drive from a tank in France could be replaced with one built in a Detroit plant the same morning. More than 10,000 105mm howitzers, capable of firing 10 rounds per minute to a range of over 12,000 yards, had been delivered to every theater of war. Foster thought of the Seabees who had built over 400 advanced bases from the Solomons to Okinawa, each one a small city of steel and pierced planking. He had read reports of Japanese officers who, under interrogation, admitted they could not comprehend such output. Admiral Toyoda's own words came back to him. "Your resources are bountiful, and your production capacity tremendous." The colonel looked through the frosted window toward the Potomac. Snow began to fall, flakes swirling like the pages of his reports. The sound of typewriters continued in the background, relentless and sure, the very music of victory. He gathered the charts and felt a quiet certainty. These numbers were not merely statistics. They were the final artillery of democracy, proof that a free people, once roused, could outbuild and outfight any tyranny. The clatter of keys in the next room rose and fell like distant gunfire, a reminder that America's arsenal had conquered not just an enemy, but the very idea that it could ever be overcome. Decades later, the sea off Saipan lay calm and bright, its coral reefs glowing like shards of glass beneath the morning sun. On the bluff above the old invasion beach, veterans from both sides gathered for a memorial ceremony. The air smelled of salt and frangipani. A soft trade wind carried the distant hum of fishing boats. Corporal Thomas Red McAllister, hair now silver and skin weathered by time, leaned on a wooden cane. Beside him stood a thin Japanese man with a measured step and a slight limp, Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi, once his enemy and now a quiet companion. Between them stretched the very ground where, 40 years earlier, McAllister had driven his bulldozer into the surf, and Takahashi had watched an endless American fleet darken the horizon. They spoke little, for memory required no translation. Takahashi recalled the bitter taste of sulfur and the sweetness of his first Hershey bar. McAllister remembered the vibration of his 20-ton machine and the clang of pierced steel planking as the runway took shape. Around them, families of both nations placed flowers and incense, honoring the dead who had fallen in the roar of naval guns and the monsoon of steel. A historian recited the numbers that once seemed impossible: 2,710 Liberty ships, 4,000 B-29 bombers, 50,000 Sherman tanks. He spoke of a wartime economy that had grown 72% while Japan's had withered, of a free people who had built more in a month than their enemy could in a year. The figures hung in the air like a final salute, a reminder that America's victory had been forged as much in factory and shipyard as on any battlefield. Uema Chie, the Okinawan schoolteacher who had survived the rains of 1945, bowed her head as the names of civilian dead were read. For her, the memory of typhoon-soaked caves and the unending convoy of ships beyond the reef remained sharp even after decades. Yet she too sensed the strange peace that time had brought, the recognition that the abundance once wielded as a weapon had become, in peacetime, a bridge between former foes. As the ceremony ended, McAllister and Takahashi walked to the bluff's edge. The sea stretched to the horizon, quiet and unbroken. Waves lapped against the coral, just as they had on that first morning of invasion. Takahashi closed his eyes and listened, not to the roar of guns, but to the steady breath of the ocean. For both men, the sound carried a single enduring truth. In the arsenal of democracy, abundance had been the ultimate weapon, and its echo still rolled across the Pacific.